This episode of the Police One podcast is sponsored by Officer Store. Learn more about getting the gear you need at prices you can afford by visiting officerstore.com. Hey, welcome back to Policing Matters on policeone.com. I'm your host, Jim Dudley. Thanks for checking in. I hope you're watching on YouTube as well. Hey, welcome to a crossover edition of the Policing Matters podcast with the Fire One podcast, Better Every Shift, with Aaron Zamzow, firefighter in Madison, Wisconsin. Aaron, tell us about your podcast.
Well, better every shift. Don't mess up that last word, which I have on numerous occasions. But we talk. It's very similar to what you guys do here on Police One, and Policing Matters is just talk about what are we seeing, what are we doing, and how can we get better? How can we be better armed? You like how I use my police reference there to handle the stress of the job, the situations that we see, and how to make those around us better. And we always talk about on Better Every Shift about learning something, doing something, moving something, and sharing something to make you and those around you better every shift. And that's really the essence of what we try to do with all of our networks, Fire Rescue One, Police One. And so it's always a pleasure, man. We always have great conversations. Unfortunately, like you and I we're kind of old dogs and we talk really well behind the scenes and then we forget what we were talking about to share. So I'm going to try to bring it to all your listeners. And again, I'm a fire officer in Madison, Wisconsin. I will be, hopefully you can term me your favorite basement saver, right? I know that's the police fire thing. And I'm happy to be your designated basement saver, favorite basement saver here on the program. So great to be here.
Yeah, and Aaron and I get together and we talk on the anniversary of 9/11. We talk about the crossover between police and fire. And there's that, misconception, misperception by the public that think police and fire, we shoot hoops together and have chili cook-offs together and all that. Well, we know about that.
Yeah.
Today, we're talking about what we're seeing in Southern California with these devastating fires. I mean, holy smokes, at least 25 deaths at last count, thousands of homes and acres burned. Fire department personnel, of course, have the toughest job of battling the actual fires themselves. EMS is dealing with injuries and transporting victims. Dispatchers, emergency dispatchers are just like at wit's end trying to answer all these calls and dealing with people that are horrified about, their homes, their loved ones, their animals, their property. But you also have law enforcement handling duties that span arson, looting, enforcement of mandatory evacuations, search and rescue, and, trying to keep people out of the zones, people that are trying to get back to their homes, or maybe they want to check on a dog or a cat or something like that. And, I thought about, how ludicrous you're going to go into this firestorm after a dog or cat. And I'm thinking about my own dog and I'm thinking, yeah, that'd probably be me too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What kind of planning is needed? I mean, long before the flames hit the trees, the houses, and everything else, there's got to be better planning, right?
Well, I think there's got to be a lot, right? This opens the door to so many different conversations, both on the police, fire, and EMS side. And I think, too, what's been highlighted, or I don't know if I want to say highlighted, but what's been brought to attention is, leadership was always thrown under the bus in certain situations, especially like this. I do want to say, right, like we don't mean to Monday morning quarterback any of this situation. We're out to try to see how police and fire and maybe get some ideas on how we can work together to help, remedy a lot of these situations. I will say, based on, what I've heard and seen and talked to, there was no stopping these fires. Like there was 100-mile-per-hour winds, such dry conditions. I honestly, I know that the devastation is horrific, but I hate to even say it could even have been worse. And the fact that, the police departments there, all of the different fire services that have responded, my hat's off to you. My heart's out to you, those that have lost. And Jim, I know you and I were saying the same thing. Just the devastation is very hard to see. It's very hard to watch. And we just want to give props to those that have responded and still probably are as they're listening to this. So keep up that good work, and don't think that we're second guessing any of those efforts. We're just here to spitball some ideas and really like the essence of our programs, trying to make each other a little bit better in this. So that being said, there's a lot that goes through these situations. The first and foremost, there's a difference between wildland fire and wildfire. I just had Bob Horton on from the United States Fire Administration. He's the head of the wildland fire or the wildfire category. And wildland fire is what usually starts in the trees. Wind hits that fire and that takes off and it burns vegetation. Wildfire is what we're seeing here in California when you have very dry conditions, houses that are very close together that aren't fire resistive, and one house with an 80-mile-per-hour wind can easily and has swept out city blocks. There are these conditions that we like to say, I call them the devil conditions because it's just what you're seeing with Santa Ana winds and those dry conditions, and these houses now having such huge fire loads within them, and even the houses themselves being a huge fire load. So this horrible kind of a combination of all these things happened, and that wind wasn't going to stop it. As Chief Fennessy said, Mother Nature beat us, and there's nothing you can do about it in some days. So I think that's kind of what you're dealing with from the 10,000 foot. What is going on there? As far as like, gosh, how do we try to combat this? I think one is to try to get predictive in it, and using technology. And you and I have talked really hardly in depth, in detail about the technology that both police and fire need to start embracing. They are starting to do some of that with, I know that Google is now on board with some satellite imagery to try to get pictures of a fire that's starting. And I think in a 5x5 square area, they can start to hone in on where that is in that location. So that's going to help us. We also need to think about drone technology, how we can use drones to help us get ahead of it and do some proactive burning. And then also some of these drones can be used to actually drop fire retardant. There's also some preventative measures that we need to take on the federal side to do some preventative burns. There's a lot, I think, that I've heard so far that can come from this in these conversations.
Yeah. Plume modeling, the weather systems that you're talking about, how we can get ahead of it. In an incident command system, even in a unified command where you have two, police and a fire chief or commanders together, fire is going to be the lead in these situations. Operations, task force, whether it's police or fire in the field. Tell us about communication during these enormous incidents, not just a fire, but hurricane, tornado, all these other things, where we have disruptions with the traditional systems. Maybe we have even a cell tower out. How are we communicating with each other?
It brings up a really good point. At one point, I know that some satellite phones were donated because fire had wiped out towers and had wiped out, cellular systems. And on that note, I think the thing that both police and fire really need to start embracing is just getting good cellular networks. I know FirstNet was started because of events like this, like 9/11, the Boston Marathon bombings, because in these situations, everybody and anybody is on their cell phones. Ultimately, though, police fire need those MDC connections. They need the comms there. And I think more departments, and I don't know what the departments are using out in California. I know locally, we don't use FirstNet like we should. And I think fire departments need to start checking into that. And because that top 10% of every tower is designated by the government, and it's broadcast through FirstNet. And I think that we need to really start utilizing that, because what happens is if we don't, the government's going to start peeling away. They're going to say, okay, not enough police um, agencies are using it, not enough fire agencies. So we're going to give 3% to this, utilities, and we're going to give 3% to whatever. So
Yeah.
first and foremost, I think we need to start really utilizing some of those. I don't want to say gifts, but some of those things that the government has really helped us try to do. So we need to embrace the cellular networks. And then what we found through here, we need to have that backup, especially in these situations where you're dealing with geographic areas that are unpredictable. They undulate. There's mountains, and we found that the satellite phones systems can really help in those situations with comms. The problem that that I've heard of so far is, how do we get those comms back to PD then? Because they may not have those satellite phones to help us with evacuation routes, to help us with controlling what are unbelievably large scenes. As you had mentioned, people trying to go back in, the danger is still there. And I understand that side of it. You had mentioned pets. I think it was Katrina that actually put it into law that we can, when we're doing rescues, we can take pets, I believe, that are now part of that. In the past, that was not allowed, and someone could correct me on that. And if they could, comment or whatever, that'd be great. But I think that's, the gist of it is utilizing the systems that we're already trying and have worked the last 10 years to develop. Now departments got to utilize that cellular side of stuff. And then I think in these situations like that are dealing with such a large surface area, the satellite imagery or satellite phones can come in. So the
Yeah.
combination of, now what we got to do is figure out how they can work together, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, back in the day, they were super expensive, and agencies didn't want to purchase them. Now they're relatively cheap, and they can be used situationally. So that can be an alternative to, standard comms. In San Francisco, we actually have an antiquated live line underground system to call boxes that are placed throughout the city. And we had this special brass call box key that you can open it up, and you'd open them up, and there's a telephone in there that directly links to communications.
Yeah.
And we test it every so often. It's fun. It's interesting what you find in those boxes sometimes. So
I was gonna say, yeah, but the concept is there. Let's add the technology to basically that direct connect concept. At one point, that's what cell phones was like the walkie-talkie cell phone.
yeah,
It's just, goes back to some of the great conversations we had on technology. Let's start embracing this technology and understanding where we can use it.
yeah,
And I think, in this case, it was kind of, donated, or these phones were given, and I think we're finding out how great they can be when utilized that way.
yeah.
So comms is always goes back to ICS. Communications is always going to be, that real emphasis, and sometimes that hiccup spot, right?
Right. Yeah. That's why, in the ICS system, we go to common terms and common language as opposed to talking in code, or talking in terms that we would only understand in our respective systems. I want to move over a little bit to PPE. So personal protection and equipment. Fire is well equipped. What about law enforcement? I know we've sent some mutual aid, even from San Francisco up into areas. And sometimes I'd hear from cops telling me that they had to put out small fires, or they
Mm-hmm.
get trapped in an area where fire's approaching, and even, one of those aluminum blankets
Yes.
to,
Yeah.
to get under would be good to have. Are we getting those out? Hot zone equipment, what do we need?
Yeah. I think that's where you start. The fire shelters would, be a good addition to it. I also think gas shutoff wrenches
Wrenches.
would be something that maybe could be put in these kits. With the PPE for wildland, it's a lighter, it's a fire resistant um, material that we have. But it's not fire retardant. It's fire resistant.
Mm,
It's lighter, but whether we could start giving PD some of them. I'm not obviously there's budgetary items there, but I think at least you start with, the flash tents, and there's a lot of those now, that some newer forms of those that are coming out to the market. Again, it comes back to, like, if there's some companies out there, as as a police department, why don't we try to throw some of these in these packets, give some training, get some education on them, just in case, right? That with an 80 mile or 100 mile per hour wind, if you have PD setting off an evacuation area and that wind switches, they could be right in the middle of it, like you said. So we want to be able to give them some things that they can use to, that would possibly keep them alive. Again, the gas shutoff switches is sometimes they're going to be in areas protecting the scene, if you would, right? Trying to make sure that people don't come back in, but there's probably some gas monitor or meters that are still active. There's probably some gas leaks, and just doing some education on how to shut some of those meters off could possibly save some homes. Chief Fennessy from Orange County Fire Authority was just on 60 Minutes, and he was touring through and traveling through some of the devastation, and that's what he found. There was fire impinging on a meter. He broke into a house and found some milk and beer, and poured it on the meter to cool it down so he could shut the gas off. Well,
Huh.
that saved 2 houses right there. So some education and giving some of these tools, I think, to PD, because they're, you guys you're in just on the outside of, hopefully on the outside of these warm zones and hot zones. And so some of those things can be key to preventive, and possibly even stopping some of that devastation.
Yeah, I mean, best plans would be to keep them out of those areas,
Right. Right.
but best plans, right? Um, we've got plans in law enforcement to cover just about anything you could think of, except for fire. I mean, I know we get some basic first aid. Well, now we have gunshot first aid. We got tourniquet training. Um, when it comes to firefighting or learning more about fires, I don't think we have the wrenches, the shut off wrenches in our
Yeah.
cars. Heavy gloves would be good. We've already got the boots and the BDUs and all that other stuff. But what else should
Yeah.
we have at a minimum in a radio car?
Well, I think too, actually hand lights and lighting systems, obviously, I think
Sure.
are key there. Maybe some reflective gear just to make sure people can eye you and see you.
Hmm.
But I think the biggest thing we can arm you with is education and training. One of the things that, I mentioned working and interviewing Bob Horton, you'd said that, what about in situations where, PD might be stressed, but not as stressed as fire? How would it go over? What about training some police officers to do some wildland fire stuff,
Hmm.
right? Like doing some cross training that way and having them, hey, we're going to take, and that's what Bob said. He's like, if you're a structural firefighter in Wisconsin, you could take courses and be part of task force that are sent out to the West Coast or East Coast or whatever to help in these situations. And maybe
Hmm.
that's a route that we could go with some of the police departments in those areas too, is recruit them to do some wildland firefighting. If anything, there should be an educational seminar that just talks about what type of things we're doing and trying to do on the fire side, and how to use weather patterns to identify the best evacuation routes,
Hmm.
and to also kind of prepare themselves in case that weather changes and there isn't proper communications. Maybe they can start to read some of the signs themselves, and make some determinants to keep people safe. If we're opening an evacuation route and that wind is changing, those comms are down, they can't get to those units. Maybe they can use some of their education to keep people out of harm's way. Um, Either way, I think, you know, opening the door between like what we're doing here and having these conversations now. And obviously in California, some people would say it's too late. It's never too late, because this is
Right.
not the last we're going to see of this.
Right.
Right. So, hey, and I know you and I will take credit for this if they want to start saying it's the police one, fire rescue one, comms concept. I don't care. I'll take it.
Yeah, for sure. I'm in. And Kathleen Diaz, a friend, colleague, she writes a column called The Rural Badge. And I think she would agree with you that in those situations, especially those rural areas, you have small town departments, or you have a sheriff's department where you have one deputy per, 200 miles of
Yeah.
terrain, then yeah, it would make sense. Throw a shovel, a pick, turnout jacket, helmet, and all those other things, because they're more likely to come across one of those kinds of fires and in the time span that it would take to get a firefighting unit up there, they may be, the only hope.
Yeah. And they can also, with better education, they might be first on scene, but boy, having more knowledge, they can relay back to those responding units, which we can maybe start to get a little bit more ahead of it. And right, we are in a data centered environments now, right? The more data we can get, the better decisions we can make. And I think that that's the same for education, right? The more education we can give PD for them that are responding, and the better off we can respond and try to get ahead of everything. So, I think that there's a lot of things that can come from this, and it goes back to comms, and not only through ICS, but even day to day, right? Just having conversations out on the beat on the street. You see fire, of course, first and foremost, you got to, donut jokes and recliner jokes and basement saver, right? Let's get all those out of the way. But then like, hey, look at evacuation routes, talk a little bit about what's going on in there, and just trying to give each other more insights as to what we're thinking and how we're responding to these, I think can really go a long way.
Yeah, for sure. And it's funny you bring up that you know that that little story you just told about the first on scene, but then given a good relay of information back. And we were just talking about real-time information centers, real-time crime centers. Talked to Sean Riley, lieutenant with Glendale PD, where close to the fires now.
Hmm.
And he talked about, from their real-time information center, they're sending out 10 fire apparatus, 5 police cruisers to this report of a car that ran into a gas station and blew up or knocked out the one of the pumps. So I guess they sent a drone there, and the drone showed there's no spewing uh, gasoline, there's no flame, there's no
There's no
real
real danger, right?
no
It's
real
just, yep.
dangers. So they reduced everything, 2 and 1 instead of 10 and 5. And they really got a handle on it and didn't needlessly take all those other resources.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hey, I want to talk about things like that real time information center, crime center, mutual aid, cross training, and debriefing. But first, I want to take a moment and thank our sponsor. Officer Store, equipping protectors with passion. That's how we operate, and it's how we live. We understand that having the right gear can mean the difference between life and death. Our goal is to get you the gear you need, when you need it, at prices you can afford. Visit us at officerstore.com. And we're back with Aaron Zamzow, firefighter and host of Better Every Shift podcast. Zam, we're talking today about these fires, but it really could be in any county across America. We should be talking about exercises, discussions like you're talking about, ensure smooth operations for fires, floods, tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes, natural or man-made disasters, right?
Yeah. Yeah. What we learned through the fires can be, you know, uh, extrapolated. I know that's a big word for a firefighter, but onto a lot of different scenarios. And the basics of all this start with communication and understanding a little bit more about what each side does and what each side expects from the other. In the case of the fires, we had talked about evacuation zones, and then also then preventing people from coming back in, because if PD can can do that, fire doesn't have to try to go back in to try to rescue. They can keep doing what they're doing, right? Like everybody's got a role to play in a lot of these situations. And so I think when you go to, mass casualty situations or active shooter situations, flooding situations, you know, the better we can, communicate. So, hey, in a flood situation, can we get PD to block this off? Because this seems to be where the water is going to be going. And, fire needs this area to help perform the rescue. Can we clear that out? Sometimes PD can be ahead of that game and understand what equipment's coming, where it's coming from, and what they're going to need, and vice versa. In an active shooter situation or a mass casualty situation, we as fire can, assist PD in, hey, we're right here for you. We're going to be we're staying behind you in these active situations, and forming rescue task forces. I just think that any type of training where you can get everybody together, but it's got to be done quickly and efficiently, and you got to stay control of that training because it can get out of hand really quickly, right? With all of us, my favorite joke to ask you guys, speaking of getting out of control fast, is I always ask every police officer, when's the last time they did a desk pop? I don't know if you know the other guys movie.
Yeah, of course.
Yep, September '08. So that's my favorite one liner. But I do believe it's taking any opportunity that we can to learn more about, just, hey, what are you doing on these calls, or what do you expect from us? Fire calls, right? I always make the joke that always look for where PD parks, because that's where the hydrant will be, and after many, many years, our police department in Madison does a pretty darn good job now of, they'll park in front of the hydrant briefly, they'll look, and then they'll go, oh shoot, and then they'll move right when you get in there. But right, like, over the years, that's actually really helped with our responses. And they're blocking traffic, but they understand, hey, this is how much we need to get through to get a ladder truck through. So, that's come from, a little bit of razzing and maybe some bad things that happened on scenes, but it also happened because they were willing to talk to us. We were willing to talk to them.
Yeah.
And from there, and that actually transferred, we had an active shooter incident in Madison. And I will tell you firsthand, PD did an unbelievable job of clearing a way for us to get through and protecting us on that scene. And it's because we did a lot of trainings together. You still have to roll with the scenario, but it's just that taking those opportunities whenever you encounter each other to maybe make each other a little bit better. That's what we just got to do on a daily basis.
Yeah. Well, that was my next question about cross training. I don't think we're doing it enough. I hearken back to 9/11 because we had grant money and we had dedicated personnel to unplug and then bring together police, fire, public health, sometimes utilities or public works, or even our parks departments ran these tabletop scenarios. What would you do? And we learned from each other, just what you're
Mhm.
saying. Like, I would stand up there and say, okay, from the police side, our incident command is going to be 5 blocks this way. We're going to put eyes on somehow. Now we could do it with drones. And fire would say, well, we're going to get right up on it and put water on it.
Yeah,
And
right.
we'd have to figure it out. And public health would come in and say, hey, look, we don't know what we have, so we need to maintain this kind of perimeter. And we would recommend this kind of PPE. So those were so great. And we moved so far from those. I know we're in our own silos a lot of the times in training. We have some agencies in America. Here in California, we have a few that are both, or actually all three, police, fire, EMS, and you bid for your shifts every few years. Sunnyvale Public Safety does that, where you're trained as a cop and a firefighter and an
Mhm.
EMT. Should we be doing that more, or are we doing just plenty? I mean, we have our specific roles and we have perishable skills. Can we even think of doing that kind of cross training?
We may have to in some communities. I think it's, I know that some of the PD are the first response to EMS in a lot of communities, and they've been doing it for years. Um, to be trained in all three and then add wildland or wildfire on top of that, I think uh, It depends on the individual, it depends on the community, and I think it depends on, really like what the need is. But I do think that there are ways to do hybrids in all of that, right? Like, what's to say we can't do, um, like train PD, especially like on the investigative side for us, we do fire investigation. I think that they should go through a police academy and be able to carry a gun
Mm,
and arson investigators, right? They have to know the fire side. So I think there's a bridge that in between, we had mentioned before, what about having PD have some wildland or some wildfire certifications or giving them some of that education. I think that's to be expected, especially in certain communities. And I think, EMS, I think that's the one bridge that you could start with, training some PD in EMS skills to make them EMTs in some of those communities that they're really hurting for personnel. Obviously,
mhm,
fire, a lot of us are already doing that. Fire's EMT and into paramedic. So I think it comes down to the demographic of the community and the need. But we're both in need, right? Police need more people, fire need more people. I think we need to start combining our efforts really a lot, because you could have someone who goes, I wouldn't be a firefighter, but all of a sudden PD catches them, right? Oh, I didn't know that police does this. And we had talked behind the scenes on how poorly we market ourselves. Now, fire, I think, is really, we're behind the eight ball on this. Everybody, right? Like the whole thing is like everybody likes to see the firefighters. Nobody likes to see PD. Well, you guys have been dealing with an image crisis for the last couple of years a lot and trying to get ahead of that through social media. Uh, Fire, we don't know how to market ourselves. We used to just walk into a place and go, we're the fire department. Well, now people are like, they're sending tweets and Tic Tacs or whatever they're calling. They don't even know we're there, right? So when we want resources, both police and fire, are people listening? And when they are we representing ourselves well? Are we educating our constituents on, like, hey, this fire in California isn't just a California problem, right? We have 3 apartment complexes, wood frame construction, that are 5 stories, that are 2 of them are still under construction. If you get a 50-mile-per-hour wind and that first one goes, they're all going, and that whole city block could go. And
mm,
we need to obviously think about that from PD side, like, holy cow, now we're going to have to think about evacuations of
mm.
this
Yeah.
neighborhood. And from the fire standpoint, we're going to have to figure out how to cut this thing off. Maybe not even, like, that's already lost. How do we get it from not losing more? And that's a switch that we're not necessarily used to in a lot of communities. So
Mhm,
I think that we need to start paying attention more to what's going on all around us. Number one, helping each other grow and be more prepared for the different things that we're now encountering. The other bridge between police and fire is the mental health crisis, because a lot of times fire called in and we're like, well, they don't need a hospital, and PD's like, they don't need handcuffs. So what do we do? How do we figure that part out? And
mhm,
some communities are doing kind of a joint task forces um, on community paramedics or cares programs, which I think are very, very effective.
mhm,
But I think we should also use those as building blocks for both police and fire. Like, hey, you want to get your feet wet? Start with the cares, and let's give you more education to get you either one side or the other. So I think they're, a round and round kind of merry-go-round of solutions. There comes back to, we got to start working together, not only on the job, but to promote our jobs,
yeah.
because and learn from each other's mistakes.
Yeah, and I mean, I'd like to wrap it up by talking a little bit about debriefings. Like, are we doing debriefings enough? Are we doing them multi-agency or just police and fire to talk things out afterwards rather than just leave with bad feelings, right? You talk about the police cruiser being parked next to the hydrant. Well, that's if we get there first. If we get there second, we go to class to find out exactly how to park on top of a fire hose.
Right, right,
And
right.
I mean, all kidding aside, uh, mental health is a big issue in police and fire. I mean, some of these firefighters and cops have been going at it for over 2 weeks at the time of this recording. I mean, by the
Yeah.
time we go broadcast, it could be a month of nonstop 15, 16, 18-hour days of, working hard. We
Yeah.
should have some mental health debriefings, don't you think?
I think for many reasons, and you touched on, one. I think we're both in this together from the standpoint we're all overworked from the standpoint of, overtimes are mandatory in a lot of departments. In California, this isn't the first time they've been fighting wildfires. They've been fighting it year round. It seems like for the last 5 to 7 years, where it used to be the season was over with in October. Well, then it was over with in November. Now there doesn't seem to be a break from that at all. And so we're doing more with less. We're not given that break in that time frame. Same thing with PD. There's constantly, there's active shooters now all the time. That's one thing. And then there's unfortunately, like with any profession, somebody just does something wrong, it's highlighted and multiplied and amplified if you're a PD, unfortunately. So then there's that stress that you have to deal with. I had mentioned we just had an active shooter scenario in Madison, and my hats off to our EAP program, where we had police, fire, and dispatch all in multiple EAP sessions,
Hmm.
and I walked away with some very positive thoughts, a lot of hugs to police officers, and I think it brought us all closer. And I think that we don't need to wait for that type of situation. Some of these situations where you have possibly a child death or a domestic abuse
Hmm.
or or even a pretty bad car accident, use these scenarios to bring some people together. We mention a lot too with fire. We're in the engine together. There's four of us. PD in a lot of cases go through this, they see this, and then they sit back isolated in a squad car.
Hmm.
And it's got to be a very helpless and hopeless feeling. And that's goes back to when I see PD in our area, like, hey, come on over, stop by, take some of our donuts. We don't need them either.
Have a bowl
uh,
of chili.
have a bowl of chili, right? Have a cup of coffee. I think that's also really important. Because we all, when it comes down to it, we're all human. We're all, as you mentioned, we're all getting stressed out. And instead of trying to make jobs harder for each other, let's try to ease that a little bit. It is us against them sometimes, you feel like, and we can at least take solace in that you guys feel the same way. So hey,
Hmm.
let's team up and make it an opportunity to bond a little bit more, and to look after each other. It's not just fire. It should be all of us.
Nice. Yeah. Hey, I appreciate it. I appreciate all of your great advice and your wisdom today. Aaron Zamzow, firefighter and host of Better Every Shift podcast. Always great talking with you.
Yeah. Thank you, buddy. It's
And we
always good
don't
to
we
see you.
don't do it enough. We don't do it
We
enough.
we don't. Well, partially it's because you're way more professional on your podcast than I am. So I'm always a little intimidated how together you are with the rehearsed questions. And I'm more of a just, hey, let's just try to get this information out. And so it's always a pleasure. You always teach me some things. So I'm always trying to get better at on the podcast side, and you've been a great mentor for me for that. So I appreciate any opportunity to talk to you, man.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for the kind words. And hey, you're living up to your words. Better every shift
Better every shift or podcast or
or
whatever you
podcast.
want to make it, right? Like,
Yeah.
yep.
Yeah. Always good talking, Aaron. I can't wait to talk to you again. Hey, stay safe and thanks for what you're doing.
Thank you, buddy. Appreciate it. You guys all be safe too.
All right. Hey, to our listeners, I hope you enjoyed it. And let me know what you think. And should we have a regular, I don't know, quarterly talk with Zam and hear what's happening on the fire side of things? See, what TV recommendations he can give, or lazy boy
What
couches.
recliners are the best on the market? Yep. What's new on the Office episodes, right? Like, certain things like that. What ingredients to put in your chili? We can give
There
you
you
anything
go.
you need.
There you go. All right. Well, drop me a line at policingmatters@policeone.com. and let me know what you think. All right. Stay safe. I appreciate you checking in on us, watching us on YouTube, or listening to the podcast while you're working out on your treadmill or on the Peloton or what have you. Take good care and stay safe. See you soon.